you everyone for inviting us all. I speak on behalf of, I think, the fellow panelists here for the opportunity to share some ideas and insights and experiences with you. I have brought a strategic bottle of water with me. I was told that if Dawie is taking part, the conversation might get heated. Don't worry, I'm prepared. I also have my phone. Please don't think I'm being antisocial if now and then I check the questions that you're all sending through online. I want to try and get as much of your feedback into the discussion as possible. I promise I'm not on Facebook. And I want to kick off the discussion with something I read a little bit earlier today. It's a quote from Benjamin Franklin. And he said, "Energy and persistence conquer all things." Now, I think in agriculture in South Africa, we definitely have the persistence component locked down. We have some of the most versatile, energetic, diverse, and dedicated agriculturalists, I think, in the world. But the energy factor is proving to be a big problem. And that's metaphorically and in terms of actual physical power to get things done. So this is a critical conversation for everyone, whether you're in primary production, whether you're further down the value chain in processing or logistics, or whether you're an input supplier and you have an agribusiness. Everyone has an important stake in trying to find the solutions. So thank you to all the panelists for taking part and providing us with your insights and experiences. I think for some context, to get some insights from our producers, let's start off with Johan and Sarel, just to get some perspective on your specific and unique energy challenges, the kind of usage, the kind of areas where you find the biggest constraints. And I think let's start down on the end there with you, Sarel.
Yeah, thank you, Anlie. We are producers in the western part of Hattingh, mostly under irrigation. We produce potatoes for the processing need. And our big challenges that we have with the energy comes from the way potatoes are produced. You do have to have a rotation for your crops. And that makes it quite difficult because you're rotating over different farms to move your if you've got let's say, a solar panel or alternative energy source to move that across different farms or even different areas on the farms to use that as an alternative for the current energy provider. And I'd say further on in this situation, we are losing some time during the days with power cuts or that we have now. You know, your systems are designed to give a certain amount of water per hectare per day. Let's say either be 8 or 10 or 12 millimeters per hectare per day. So if you lose 6 or 8 hours or 4 hours per day, it's impossible to catch up with that lost water irrigation that you were supposed to give. And that makes it, you put your crop under a big risk. And that poses also a big problem for us, or a big risk factor, especially looking at on a crop like potatoes, where you've got really quite a high input cost. It makes your risk factor quite big, and it's very difficult to mitigate that risk in this situation.
Sarel, just for context, do you have alternative energy systems in place, and if so, what are they?
Well, at this stage, we only have mobile diesel generators that we move around, and you cannot do this sustainably on all your crops because most of your grain crops hasn't got that high value. So you rather focus on something like your high value crops, potatoes or whatever, and you can move around that and try and get to your levels, moisture levels on your ground, but that's not sustainable.
Johan, over to you. Give us a brief context of your situation.
Yes, thanks, Anlie. Yeah, we are more or less in the same situation as Sarel. We also produce processing potatoes for the likes of the McCains and the Simbas of the world. And as Sarel said, well, we produce, try to produce around the country. We've got a sort of 12-month contract. So that needs us to farm in various areas. All the farms doesn't belong to us, so we rent some of the farms. So to put up renewable energy or solar or whatever on a rental farm doesn't make sense at all. As Sarel said, potatoes is a very high value crop. And I don't want to really quote numbers here, but I mean, the risk in losing potatoes not being irrigating efficiently can have a big loss on your crop, and that means a big loss in income. We also then have a pack shed just outside of Pretoria where we wash and pack, where we've got cold rooms, and we produce some of our own seed. We keep some of our own seed, and the cold rooms obviously has got to stay at a certain temperature at between 3 and 4 degrees. And that's where load shedding becomes quite a problem, because if you lose that cold chain, there's a lot of money in that cold rooms that you can lose. So we've got the alternatives in generators that we've got at the pack house. But as you know, I mean, the cost of diesel at some stage is just not efficient enough anymore. And the cost and the risk is so high that, I mean, we've evaluated our situation in planting, and we've reduced it quite a bit, and mainly because of the energy crisis that we've got at the moment. Because to put so much effort and everything, and there's a lot of other things that also can go wrong. It's not just the energy, the Escoms and the electricity crisis. There's a lot of other things, and the risk just becomes so high that you've got to rethink your strategy going forward in planting, and especially where we're talking potatoes now. And that made us go back to the drawing table, and we've decided to plant much less potatoes the years coming. And one of the main reasons is definitely the energy crisis that we've got at the moment.
In your negotiations with the companies that you have contracts with, what kind of reception do you get from them in terms of their understanding of the constraints? You know, are they looking to shift those agreements to other suppliers? Because that's not sustainable for your business either. So and everyone's in the same position in terms of experiencing the impact of the energy crisis. But what kind of reception are you getting?
Well, I think there's quite a bit of willingness to get some information. Maybe just the other point that we need to also express is that, you know, especially with sun energy, we also need the energy at night for irrigation purpose. So, you know, sun energy is not at the end of the day the solution for us. We need some either backup batteries or whatever, or diesel generation. And so we, at this stage, I must say, we're struggling to find the best solution to solve this problem.
Faure, I want to come to you to maybe give some insights from the industry into, we're going to get into big solutions and the way forward a little bit down the line. But what are your initial thoughts just listening to the context painted by the two producers we have with us today?
Great, thank you. So when we look at the feasibility of a solar PV or hybrid system, we typically have to look at the load profile in terms of the consumption. And clearly, listening to your seasonal application, there's a time period where it would work great, but then there's, you know, nighttime can be overcome with storage, for example. But there's still this big gap in terms of not utilizing that technology. So, and that then becomes a challenge, because then you would like to have a solution that you would possibly want to transport between sites. And that's where the generator approach is then the way to go. The only thing I'm thinking of in the context of the mechanisms that's in place that might change the financial model to make it more plausible would be to say, put in a big enough alternative supply solution that could be a combination of battery storage and solar, wind if you're in the right place. But where you could benefit from your system in the non-seasonal periods is, for example, an option which we refer to as banking. I know Eskom has this banking option where you're allowed to export excess power, and that excess power you then build up credits where you can then utilize that in the seasonal period. So that's one option. The other option would be wheeling, which is actually quite new. It's a new concept that's coming in. And wheeling in principle says that you can then say, whatever excess power I push back into the network, I wheel to my other points of supply or to my other consumers. And that doesn't have to be, let's say, one of your own plants or one of your own clients. It could be another off-taker that's part of the supply chain that says, listen, I'm consuming a lot of power. I don't have sufficient space for solar, but I'm willing to buy the electricity from you at a rate. And obviously, when one needs to look into the cost in that regard. So the mechanisms are there to say in that non-seasonal period, what do I do with this excess energy if the solar PV plant is fixed there? And it might be that, for example, maybe it's just the storage component that you're moving between sites, but the solar stays there in terms of the energy side. Obviously, the wheeling only allows for energy to be transported from one point to another, but it does not cover the load shedding aspect. For there, you will need something other than storage or backup generation, or like we said, some other form of technology that can supply the power when there's insufficient power from renewable energy.
So we're going to get into a little bit more of the technicalities down the line. I want to take a step back and come to you, Dawie. You said we are in an energy revolution. Was that you?
I mentioned it, but
that was you,
it's fine.
sorry.
But, yeah.
Okay. I want to still direct the question to you. A revolution often is coupled with a revolt. And I think there's a question from many South Africans in the business space whether there is anything more to be done. Because we hear this constantly that we need to take matters into our own hands. You need to become independent. You need to stop relying on solutions to be provided for you by government, and we need to create those solutions ourselves. Apart from that sort of empowered, independent, free-thinking, let's take charge attitude, is there anything more that needs to happen from society in terms of a broader social, let's call it a revolt for lack of a better word, that could have an impact on the energy situation, or is it very much out of our hands?
Can I sort of approach it slightly differently?
Approach it how you like.
Let me just give the revolution part maybe some context. I did mention there are 30 million people getting an income from the state every month. We've got perhaps about 1.5 million people paying just about all the personal income taxes. We've got less than 1,000 companies, 770 companies paying 2/3 of all company taxes in the country. We've got unemployment levels, pick a number, but it's high, very, very high. We've got rising levels of absolute poverty in South Africa. We've got rising food prices. We've got a coming election. This is a toxic mix. I'm not talking about a revolution, but I'm talking about possibility of people in the streets burning stuff down. So that I'm very, very concerned about something like that. And politicians, politicians, they like to stir things a little bit. Another angle to this is that technological progress that is happening, and that's also a revolution. A revolution is not necessarily a negative thing. A revolution can be a positive thing. We are currently in a fourth industrial revolution, basically, where we're moving into, for example, artificial intelligence. It's probably gonna. I just read a report this morning. 300 million people are probably going to lose their jobs in the next couple of years because of artificial intelligence. Your job, by the way, is on the line because journalists are potentially on the line as well, and economists. Just by the way, the economist's job should have been on the line a long time ago, I believe. So that is a revolution that is happening as well. And then another angle that I think is important to understand is that, coming back more to your question, is that remember what is the nature of a state? A state is nothing but an organization that monopolizes violence. That's what the state does. The state monopolizes violence. And the social pact is between us, the people, and whoever runs the state, the government. And the social pact is, I will not take the law in my own hands. I will give the right to take the law. I will cede that to the state. I will fund the state with my taxes, and the state must look after me. That is called that is a state. So they use violence. They monopolize violence. I'm not allowed to do that, and they use this violence to protect me. So that's the social pact in a very crude way. That's not happening in South Africa. The state has broken the social pact, the ANC government. So why should we keep on paying taxes? Because they've broken their side of the deal. So what I'm also concerned about is that the state is collapsing. The state is not collapsing, government. The state hasn't failed, the government has failed to a large extent. And we see that in infrastructural things, but we see it in all sorts of institutions in South Africa also, under tremendous strain. And that's where the opportunity in a way. So I think we don't have a choice but to take matters in our own hands to a lot. And we're doing that. And I think we're doing an excellent job in that. So I think we must continue doing that. So simple things. Know who your neighbor is. Join whatever organizations like what we're doing here. That's that kind of thing. Because some people say that we have to create a state-proof institutions. And perhaps that is the way to go about it.
Hawie, just looking at the broader context of investment in clean energy. You mentioned $2.4 trillion invested in clean energy globally. How does that compare to the global current spend on outdated forms of energy, fossil fuels? And not to be controversial, but we're looking at finding some sense of balance where we have to acknowledge that the energy systems we have are broken. We cannot keep investing more money into broken energy and to redistribute it?
Caught me off guard there. I don't have a specific figure. I think it's the trajectory that's quite significant and important in that pure fossil fuel-based major investments. I mean, people in the financial industry, Dawie and Co., and those clever people will tell you that there seems to be a bit of an aversion for those investors to keep on perpetuating fossil fuel based new fixed investment, right? So that current balance, I'm not sure, but it's pretty much grinding to a halt if one looks at the international stats. So. In South Africa, obviously, a bit different because you know that we are sitting with this dilemma that I think currently is at 54% or something. Maybe Faure will know better, of the total mix still sitting in coal, right? And so it's a good reason for it because we got that natural resource. So how about just being a bit more smarter in terms of extracting and utilizing, right? So I suspect the South African trajectory is going to be slightly different. It's just a personal view. It's not an official one. Because we know that level with remember the added pressure and this whole debate about decarbonizing and reducing greenhouse gas emissions whilst you have precisely what Dawie said, massive unemployment and a whole range of other socioeconomic issues. So therefore, the thinking would be to perhaps over time transition much more slower than perhaps global counterparts would be, because they've got those other two driving forces. Remember, they're big on climate change. Here with us, Dawie's right. Here, it's about are people surviving, or so are enterprise being set up, and are people being employed, yes or no. So yes, this other big debate is very important, but I suspect here where we are and where the continent is going, possibly going to find perhaps better ways to utilize that existing so-called outdated, very dirty natural mineral resource base for many of the technologies, by the way, that we've spoken about. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but I think our trajectory is different. The specific number I am not sure of. Point is, globally, if you look at those trends, clearly that's where the money is flowing. So if you look at the other slide we had was on technological innovation. So that primarily being driven by private sector, and it's purely in the clean energy space. So it's not going to stop. With us, it's a bit different. I think we only number 33 in terms of R&D spend or something, which is actually not bad given our situation. But so at a global level, or as a composite number. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but it's slowly dying a certain death. I mean, globally, that's what one is observing through the media and papers and people like International Energy Agency. However, South Africa, different story. Maybe this is the opportunity. I think one of the speakers mentioned it. So creating opportunity, using this dilemma, using this crisis as an opportunity to create true local solutions, meaning local at a local level, but across a value chain, across a local geography, in our case South Africa and beyond, as opposed to just, shall we say, copy-pasting global so-called I must say, so-called cleaner technologies, because I'm not completely convinced, by the way. There has to be something beyond lithium. We cannot be this dependent upon China. This is a danger zone.
I want to come back to that local, global China situation with you, Dawie, in a second.
Yeah.
But I wanted to look specifically at the balance. We've looked at the balance of investment for it, the balance of generation and storage innovation. I think Hawie showed us a graph a little bit earlier where we saw a lot of green, what you called mature technologies on the side of storage, but fewer available technologies on the side of generation. And there, that becomes very important for guys like Sarel and Johan, where they need to have a balance of both. They need to be able to generate when obviously the sun, when the power source is there. But, you know, if that doesn't also tie into existing models and the grid, etc., we're still at a loss.
So I think the challenge that we have is that we need to work with the technology that's there or that's available, and obviously solar having a limitation in terms of what it can produce during the day. If you were, for example, just as an example, combine that with wind, the two can actually complement each other quite well if it's a wind resource area. We've seen that on our farm where we're totally off grid, and you know, if it's not, as soon as the sun sets, the wind starts to pick up and you've got some generation during the night. And we see that also on a cloudy day. If it's cloudy and limited sunlight, there's typically wind associated with that. So it really complements the two. And the challenge is that you are, in terms of that, and even all the other options, you are in a way limited to where you are located and what other resources or materials are available for that specific area. So, for example, it might be that you situated next to a river, or there's a big dam, where hydro or a water pump scheme could be a potential solution because of what's already there.
I'm going to stop you there, Faure, because it's all very well to talk about all the solutions available. Solar, wind, biomass, hydrogen cells, it all goes a little bit above my head some days. But it's pie in the sky unless they are accessible in terms of capex. Sarel, Johan, maybe you could give us a perspective on the realistic access of producers in South Africa, given the multitude of challenges, weather challenges, climate change, infrastructure challenges. It's the list is never ending, and that you're so positive despite that is very heartening. What can you physically access?
Well, I think at this stage, if we just talk practically, the input cost, and especially in potato side, has gone up so much. And, well, from our side, I think we've been ignoring the solar and alternative energy for a few years now because, well, everybody keeps on saying it's like the iPhone. If you've got or the computer, if you've got one today, tomorrow it's outdated. So we're waiting for that perfect and where the price is right. But I think the time has come now that we've definitely got to look at it and investigate. And we've obviously, and I think from a practical side, the issue for us now is there's obviously so many, from a farmer's perspective, there's so many guys out there that want to come and give you quotes. And listening now to Faure and Hawie, there's a lot of ways that you can go. And the thing is to make the right decision there. And then the other thing is, I mean, 5 years back, I think it was expensive. It's still very expensive. And where to get the funding? And I hear the banks and everybody and organizations like where Hawie is now, there's a lot of funding available and grants and so on available. And, well, my question will be how easy is it to qualify which is the best guys to go with and how to access that funding, and what do? You just, I know where to go to ABSA, but I'm not sure where to go to all the other places.
Sarel?
Yes, I think the one thing we did a very thorough investigation and calculation on what we're paying in 21-22, and only 56% of the amount that we were paying to the electricity provider was for energy. The rest was for line rental, admin, and whatever other costs. And the other big thing is that if you, let's say, you're not adding anything to your production capacity if you go to an alternative, so you're not increasing any capacity.
Yeah.
So you just mitigating your risk
Yeah.
at quite a big cost. But unfortunately, we're going into that direction that we've got to do it. Otherwise, we might end up without a sustainable operation.
Hawie, yes. I'm glad you're raising your hand because at the same time as you address the point that you want to raise, perhaps you could give us some insights into the accessibility of those incentives, tax breaks, etc., for solar and alternatives.
Thank you. So tax breaks, National Treasury, so completely different space. We can't speak on their behalf. Before I get to that one, may I just add a point on this issue of, okay, so how do you now capitalize this, a mixture? Let's say someone has engineered an interesting puzzle piece from two, three technologies lumped together, minimizing your total cost of supply, as Faure said, life cycle cost. But hey, there's no Standard Bank, no ABSA, nobody there, because that are keen to fund the entire transaction. I'm foreseeing a future where some of these so-called, Faure, you may know, the what do they call themselves? Energy supply companies, ESCOs, is becoming a new feature. And I think the point was made earlier, I can't remember, Dawie or someone, about this decentralization in a way of energy. So meaning that as we speak, maybe it's a bit too early to say exactly where that solution is going to be found, but it's going to be found in a different paradigm and a different institutional vehicle that perhaps then it's almost electrons as a service type thing for, I don't know whether that's correct. I mean, engineering friends must check each other, but I think this is where it's going to go. So meaning we're going to find a whole new ecosystem developing of those that are then able to project engineer, put it together, so that the client can still do what they want to do. So they stick to their primary business, packaging, processing, whatever that is, transportation, and you have a third party that actually puts it all together. So it's almost like a, shall we say, miniaturized version of an ESCOM, of a previous ESCOM, I don't know, for lack of a better word, right? So geography by geography, or perhaps across production of value chains, or perhaps concentrated areas of major production or value adding. I suspect that's potentially where it's going to go, meaning at this dimension of different institutional structures in the future that'll help to engineer these solutions. That's personally what I think is going to happen. In addition to a different type of source of capital being roped into those. So therefore a bit of a disruption to the existing classical way of saying, you know what, we're not going to invest or provide debt finance here because we don't see an IRR or an equity investor, we don't see an IRR of 11, 12%, so we're not interested. Many of these technologies won't give you that if they stick to the existing classical, well, maybe a 10, 15-year evaluation period of the cash flow model. So you're going to need different type of capital to capitalize this. But I'm suspecting this third party, shall we say, institutional new ecosystem is going to be the one that comes up with those solutions. To your previous point about the incentives, remember those industrial incentives, it's really taxpayers' reinvestment and co-investment into projects, right? So believe it or not, on the high end, the critical infrastructure program or incentive that I mentioned a bit earlier, that typically could co-fund a particular installation, hopefully cleaner, that again, it falls into that space where a bank is saying, listen, but if you can de-risk this 20, 30%, yeah, maybe then we'll look at it because it starts getting appetizing for us to fund it as a classical transaction, even though we know very little about a hydrogen manufacturing plant, first time we see one. But that technology is actually well proven. I mean, it's on our doorstep, right? I'm just picking one example. So then we're able to financially engineer it in such a way that one would plan for this upfront, obviously, because with DTI, because it's taxpayer money, people will have to do their paperwork, they'll have to apply well in advance, go through a whole committee and due diligence process, et cetera, but then depending on how it was structured, so typically for that entity that drives that engineering solution, they could qualify, as I mentioned here on the top end, 50 million rand per installation. And then there are a few percentages that also kick into play there, i.e. 40-60 if it's a pure private institution, 80/20 typically if it sits within existing SEZ or one of the industrial areas. So there's some fine print and rules which one will have to understand. But the point being that those are available. I mean, in the space that Faure plays, there's another component. Just looking at, for instance, crafting the bankable feasibility for it, kept at 5% of the total feasibility. Maybe it is a mega scale one. So this is maybe on the top end, quite a large, big vision across the entire region, perhaps capped at 50 million rand and or 5% of the cost of the BFS. So typically that's the cost of this is now on the front end, that the engineers would need to then engineer that particular project. So there's another possible contribution. So that's on the infrastructure side. And then I previously mentioned some of the innovation ones. So that really is targeting those that are really brave at heart and are saying, we've heard about this thing about the compressed air solution. That sounds interesting. Oh, by the way, that technology is being developed as we speak. There's a small company in Krugersdorp that's starting to export it to Australia, as I previously mentioned. So saying maybe we should scale that for our operation, because that's one thing we know we got here. We don't have wind, we don't have solar, we've got hydro issues, whatever. Okay, fine. So how about in your project engineering work, enlisting the service of a project engineer? So typically that's what they do. Spec it, decide whether it's feasible technically, and then build a commercial model around it and say, okay, but there's a bit of adaptation that I want to do here, because what I want to do is I want to use in this case now, the wastewater that comes from it, which typically could fill a swimming pool once a day that comes from the air, but we're going to have to treat the water. So there's a bit of innovation still to happen there before we figure it all out in South Africa. Okay, fine. So how about defining then that as a project and then applying to one of those incentives at the high-end risk sort of curve? I think it's 15 million, I think, over a 3-year period, saying, listen, I want to engage a few clever academics and others, and we want to engineer that solution for our specific purpose. So that's another possibility. Again, must apply beforehand, and did leave some contact details, but we can go into the detailed criteria at some other point. And then there was the other one that purely not so much on a research innovation side, but on then prototyping, as it were, a particular process or a product. So 3 to 5 million rand per project. Just remember the undertone here is these are private enterprises applying directly for what will benefit them. This is not some social scheme, CSI type spending. Unfortunately, those projects are receiving a lot of due diligence prior to approval, and once approved, obviously they've got to execute according to plan. But I don't know whether it partly answers some of the question. I don't want to do a whole publicity stunt here.
No, absolutely. I think that's valuable information. Dawie, the situation in China. If I'm not correct, if I am correct, most of the solar panels PV technology currently comes from there, correct, Faure? Right.
Batteries.
Yeah, but most PV, we could argue most comes from China, but it's actually Southeast Asia and batteries. So a big portion of that is still input for that. I can actually mention in terms of panels, there are local manufacturers that's pushing up that local content portion. So there's movement in that regard,
Because that was going to be my question as well, is whether we have the industrial capacity to localize production should the situation in China and Taiwan become very problematic, and what your sort of, not prediction, but your gut feeling is around timelines.
You want to ask Dawie first? Yeah.
Yeah, but the local production capacity, I don't know. I think you will probably give a better answer to that. But perhaps angle to this will be a bit of a BRICS answer, I guess. Now, South Africa shouldn't be part of BRICS. I mean, we are so small. I mean, we shouldn't be part of BRICS. But we got a lucky break there, and we are part of BRICS. I think it's a good thing to be a member of the BRICS group. I think the reason why we're part of BRICS is because we basically represent Africa. In early June, there will be a meeting of foreign affairs ministers in South Africa of the BRICS countries, and there are 19 countries wanting to join BRICS. And I'm very excited about certain countries, like, for example, Saudi Arabia wanting to join BRICS. We don't currently have a member in the Middle East, and countries like, for example, Iran. Keep in mind that there's some other political changes happening as well. They recently made peace. The Chinese, or rather the Saudi Arabians and the Iranians, is that right? They made peace, and the war in Yemen is probably going to come to an end. The point is, clearly, BRICS is becoming a more important force, and I think China will gradually lose its dominance as the world's factory. China's economy is gradually moving more to a consumption economy and moving a little bit away from a production of the world's factory. They're exporting a lot of those factories to places like, for example, Vietnam and many other places as well. So I think that is likely to continue, and places even like India is probably going to take over some of that production. Also keep in mind that countries, especially in the West, are deglobalizing to a large extent, especially the Americans, taking some of their factories out of China and some of the Southeast Asian countries, moving it back to America. And so I think maybe just an interesting comment about the BRICS countries talking about creating their own currency. That's not going to happen soon, just by the way. But if there is a new currency, it's probably going to be a renminbi-dominated kind of currency. But the Chinese is going to be around for some time still, but I think that is going to spread all over the world more.
I'm going to come back to you in a moment, Hawie, but Faure, on that point of local production capacity, if you can address that for us, and if you can perhaps address some concerns from Johan and Sarel around finding someone who can engineer a bespoke solution for your business operation and the unique challenges and geographical area and production requirements that you face in a challenging environment where without specific industry knowledge, you have to having to make a decision that could potentially carry the sustainability of your entire enterprise.
Yeah.
And there are so many fly-by-night operations. We've all heard about them. What's your advice?
Okay. So on the local content was actually a very big theme in the renewable energy program since 2011. So with every gradual bid, the local content percentage actually increased with the intention to have a localized industry around this. And I don't know if a lot of people know this, but South Africa won an international award for how we did the program, the renewable energy program in the first few years. That's when, before there was this time delay or blockage of things happening. And in that time period, we had people manufacturing solar PV panels, we had inverters being produced locally, and a lot of the other equipment also produced locally. Yeah. And then there was the stop, so the start-stop activity. And a lot of the industry said, listen, if we don't have a pipeline of projects or output that we need to deliver, we can't stay. So they backed up and they moved out of the country, which was quite sad, because if you think of, if they were here today, where they would have been in the context of our local need in terms of all of these different components. So where we are now, in a way, they're trying to get that back up and running again. We do have local producers on the whole food supply chain. There are some aspects, for example, batteries, the cells need to be imported from China. So that's not been manufactured locally. And I think that's where vanadium, redox, and hydrogen then becomes a little bit more local, because it's not just limited to cells. Yeah. But at least it's been assembled, and the BMS and everything that comes together is local. Solar PV suppliers, they are local producers, although they don't necessarily compete with the international market in terms of the quality of the products. But there are now, for example, Seraphim that's coming in, and they want to increase that local content component. The challenge, however, there is the import tax on the commodities. So that makes it difficult for them to compete with the Chinese models that's being imported into South Africa. So that's in terms of local content. Yes, there's opportunities, and I would foresee that can be more if we have a more sustained industry that they know, okay, we have off-takers going forward. And South Africa, we shouldn't limit to South Africa. Africa is the whole scope. So,
may I ask something? What import duties are there in the local on this import stuff? So
I would first kick. So now how it now works is all the solar PV panels manufactured locally is on assembly approach. So assembly, as in that, the cells, the frame, the laminate, everything is imported separately, and then they assemble it. But they want to produce a lot of these things locally, with the intention that, even the cells are manufactured locally. And I don't have the exact to say what it is that they have import tax, but they said that there's some taxing in place that makes it difficult for them to get the pricing right, for to compete with the competitive market. So, but they are working towards that, and I would foresee, hopefully, that we will see more locally produced panels, because, interesting enough, Seraphim, again as an example, they actually produce the panels cheaper here for the export market because of the energy cost to produce it, and there's believe it or not, because they and other factors as well. So there's a lot of opportunity in terms of the local production and supply chain to get that going. And I think the load shedding situation has made that there will be a sustained need in that regard. To come back to the question about, okay, but where do I find someone that can help us with the solution? Because there's a lot of fly-by-nights and cowboys out there. We don't like to talk about bucky brigades because all the installers, even the good ones, will have a bucky brigade installing systems. But I think, unfortunately, there's not one specific entity or group. I think ESCOs would be one starting point to consider. To say, okay, they've got people that looks holistically to your energy need, not just in terms of we want to sell a solar system, because that's sometimes a challenge. But I think the benefit is as soon as it's a large enough project and financially it has enough weight, the banks itself has their own technical team together that can actually look into these things. And they have a lot of requirements to fund a project. And I'm talking about even if they employ a third party, to say, do they have a PR professional engineer? Do they have references? Are they financially strong enough? Do they have industry accreditation? The list goes on. So I think if you're going to go for the funding model from the banks, they do have checks and balances in place. But I would actually propose to say, do an investigation to find an engineer that could look holistically at your energy need, but also propose holistic proposals in terms of energy solutions and fulfill an owner's engineer role. Because the reality is you're not engineers. You don't understand the energy field. You don't know the technology that's there. So to have someone, employ someone, maybe it's for the industry, not just for specific individuals or companies, to say that we employ them and say, do a detailed investigation, look at our landscape, because that was a question mark. We didn't know what was the energy need. And then based on that, what's available and what should we look at or develop possibly for solutions in terms of what we need. So I would really propose to pull someone in like that to help you in that regard.
It seems that a big part of the whole energy crisis is all around timing and timelines. Where we are in the maturation of technology, where we are in terms of global timelines. And then you have to boil that down as well to where a business finds itself in terms of its own unique challenges. So I want to come to you both, Johan and Sarel. If I can start with you, Johan. And this is a bit of projection. Each business reaches critical mass, a tipping point where you can no longer continue either financially, mostly financially, with current production models. How far down the line do you estimate that is before you absolutely cannot function under the current constraints? And we know, last night they said more than 50% of our grid currently offline, which is why we're on stage 6. So that timing becomes more and more critical.
Yeah, well, I think if you look at the input cost, I think the energy of the ESCOM will, I say, between 7-8% of the input cost. So that's not that big. And the critical part is, and I think Sarel touched on that, is that if there's during the whole time that the potato is growing, you need at certain times a certain amount of water. And there's definitely some critical times that if you can't give water, then you can lose the whole crop. So then that 6 or 7% becomes the whole input cost, and you can lose your whole crop, or you can lose a lot of yield on the potato crop, and that's where the industry, I think, is gone, and that's where a lot of research is going in, and it's all about the cost and then the yields, and the only way we can get to be profitable is to increase the yields, and for the yields it's critical. There's a lot of things that must go right, and one of the most important thing is the irrigation, the water. You've got to get that right.
So what I'm hearing is we've almost passed that critical point where we can no longer function as we have been. Sarel, in terms of moving a little bit further down the value chain and looking at processing, what are your pressure points there, and how does that balance out your whole operation in terms of energy requirements and where you need more sustainable methods?
Well, we're not involved that much in the processing, but we are delivering the processor. So that you can see, is a risk. We also got to take that risk into consideration from our side for what types of crop and how much we're going to produce, to see if it's viable for us to take that risk. And as Johan said, the energy cost is not that much in our production cost, but we're considering scaling down about 30 to 40% on our total irrigation crops, which is not only potatoes, different crops, because we've got to, one way or the other, mitigate this risk, the Eskom risk for us, and that's posing a bigger risk in the whole food production industry for South Africa.
This might be a silly question from someone who's only been in agriculture for 2 years, so bear with me. Does having a mixed farming operation relieve some of the pressures? Because you have to look at the fact that we also, and we spoke about this a little bit prior to the start of today's event, industries and commodities are kind of working in silos at the moment, looking at their own pressure points, looking at climate change pressures, looking at energy pressures, looking at input costs in terms of their specific commodity. So there's very little information, or it seems there's not a holistic oversight looking at where there is interplay and room for cross-commodity collaboration, or even within one operation where one commodity can really relieve some of those energy pressures, or, for instance, potatoes.
Yeah, well, I think in terms of, to diversify your operations, and I think you spoke about the fact that farming is becoming more like a corporate business, that you must mitigate and you must diversify to have other sources of income. But just talking specifically from an irrigation perspective, and we only do irrigation, and there's obviously a lot of dryland farmers that farm potatoes that way. From an irrigation perspective, if you're irrigating potatoes or seed maize or citrus, it's the same thing. And the other industries, you've got your other challenges for export, especially on the citrus side, and so there's obviously other challenges there also.
Hawie, perhaps you can give us some insights into what needs to happen, looking at this whole value chain picture. How do we get all that information together, and what is really going to help agriculture as a whole?
Whoa. As I mentioned,
No pressure.
As I mentioned, I'm not an agriculturist. We only enjoy chips.
But you talk from the perspective of gathering information from various sources.
Yeah. So I don't know. We did mention it, and I think some of the other speakers mentioned it. I think it's about I don't know. As an engineer, I would say proper stock take of where one's at the moment across this entire value chain. Who's consuming what sort of level of energy? What is constraining whom to grow to what extent? And obviously to balance the entire, it sounds a bit theoretical, but I think one will have to get to that point of being very specific, very factual in the numbers, and then translating that in terms of energy requirements per across the value chain. Hopefully that's trying to answer your question. And I think only then would one be able to know whether is there then a foreseeable gap, and surely, this is what I would imagine this association or this forum does, also try and think in the future, 5-10 years hence, where we're going to go, or continent, export-wise, so forth. Then try and determine what that gap is, and then translate that back and reverse engineer, if you'd like, solutions that, as we just discussed today, there are so many that are coming commercially available, and then to start plugging holes where the most pain is felt. So I don't have a single answer or solution to any particular pocket across the value chain, neither a particular technology option. We did mention a few that are, for me, absolute no-brainers. Vanadium flow batteries for storage, hydrogen fuel cells as we speak. By the way, to your previous point, they're setting up a plant next to Oliver Tambo, a company called Isondo. We funded some of the applied research and development work, so they're going to be manufacturing electrolyzers, which, as you know, is a critical component. That's the key thing globally that's been chased in the hydrogen economy. So get the electrolyzer cost down, you're going to get the hydrogen cost down. So they just about, the plant is being built as we speak, so local. So that type of space the air well, I don't know, Faure may have a few others up his sleeve, but compressed air and a few others which are so obvious and more sustainable than I think what we've seen to date. But maybe we shouldn't go into that debate. So I don't know. I think it's a proper assessment to understand where one's at the moment. Where is it that this entire industry wants to go over a period of time? Mapping that delta and trying to figure out from energy demand and availability point of view, where are things headed? I think nowadays it could be one could be able to make reasonably accurate estimates of whether this load shedding is just going to disappear. I think you can model it fairly accurately into the future and then say, okay, but that gap is so much. So in that gap, what constitutes some of the components or puzzle pieces to go and reduce the net energy demand? I don't know whether that answers your question.
So could I just make a follow-up point or maybe a question to Sarel and Johan? Have you quantified, because it was very clear that the energy cost component is not your challenge. It's the availability thereof that has a much larger impact. So were you able to determine or quantify what that loss would be or were because of not being supplying the power? I don't know if you have any numbers on that, more or less. I'm putting you on the pressure. But if it's not, that's where part of the investigation would be to quantify what is the opportunity cost, is typically how they determine it, but what's the losses due to not having power available. And as soon as you have a number there, then all of a sudden costing or pricing or paying for the capex becomes less of an issue because you can justify it from that point of view. If you're saying 5 or 7% is your energy cost, I would foresee that in a few instances, just going for an alternative supply, you would reduce that because of the solutions that's there over the lifetime, obviously, right? So where you pay it off in 4 or 5 years. So there's already a benefit, and then you address the impact of not having power supply. So there's an additional percentage you can add to that. So that's actually a question, if you don't mind, and to add to Harvey's point.
Sorry, may I add to so this variability of supply, believe it or not, very few people are talking about it. But if you look at our current energy mix, I looked at some CSR numbers on Saturday. So the variability in supply, solar, wind, CSP, barring and perhaps excluding hydro, but all of them are all over the place. I mean, so from a pure manufacturing and industrial perspective, the standard deviation is just, I just don't know how we're coping, by the way. But to Faure's point, so then the challenge becomes how do you design for a balance of all of these various technologies? Remember, we mentioned generation technologies, production technologies, storage, transportation, very important in your industry. You've got to get from A to B or get to a processing plant to get to a mechanical process. So all of that balanced in such a way that you minimize that variability, because I think that's really what is happening here. So cutting down production 30%, that's actually the number, is being done. Why? Because you don't have that reliability of supply. And it's because, by the way, even if you do just slap solar and wind to it, you're still going to be sitting with unpredictability unless you have very sophisticated storage solutions, and pretty much going to cut down again, maybe 5 or 10%. So all of that has to be rethought and re-optimized across or in that particular space now. And I think that's where we're at. That's what makes us, in a way, daunting, but still also quite feasible, because we're so close to so many of these other parts of the puzzle piece, requiring someone just to seek synergy between them to minimize this variability that we got.
Perhaps a question from the floor, if I can throw this in, because I think it speaks to what we're trying to get at. I'm going to throw this one to you, Sarel. And this is a question from Viljoen. What technologies, alternative energy technologies, have you been exposed to? What do you think of it? And at what point would you trust it enough to make an investment?
At this stage, I think the only alternatives that we were looking at and that was kind of commercial available is your parts, the sun, solar, and then diesel generation. And maybe just to come back to one of the questions, what would be the cost for us if how can we quantify the risk? We were quite blessed the past 2 seasons that we had abundance of rainfall that could pull the crops through. But going forward and looking at the possible El Nino year that we might have in the next production season, that's why it's so difficult to predict it, and we rather cut back on production to try and manage that risk.
Dawie. And I want to bring it back to politics. I'm very hesitant to do so, but unfortunately that does come into this whole mix. You painted a picture of what we could be facing in the next elections. And unfortunately that very much informs the policy framework that all this new technology ties into. What are you seeing are some of the political fluctuations and attitudes where energy is concerned that place severe constraints on allowing these new technologies to take over?
There's only one thing, and that is that this government wants to control everything, and they can't control anything. And they're very reluctant to let go. And now look, for example, it was illegal to generate electricity, and then you could generate 10 megawatts, and then you could generate, I think I increased it to
100
now. Eventually 100, and now you can generate as much as you want. So that's an example. They simply do not want to let go. And that is the biggest challenge, is that we've got a government that believes in centralization of stuff, and they are eventually going to get let go, because this is a classic example where you get reality clashing with ideology. So they've got a certain ideology, but reality is something else, and eventually reality obviously wins. Can I just add? I've been listening, and I'm not an expert in this sort of stuff, but I've put in a solar system myself, and I've done a lot of numbers on that, and I've realized a couple of things, and I don't know if this applies to everybody. And I've got a few tricks that I've learned on how to pick a solar supplier that I've learned. First of all, they always generate less than what they tell you they're going to generate.
That's true.
It always costs more than what tell them it's going to generate. If you want to pick a solar supplier, you go to one of his clients, previous clients, and you ask that client to call him and tell him there's something wrong with the inverter and see if he comes out. So that's the most important one. See if you can get after his service off. That's the most important. But also look at we've seen an increase of an interest cost of nearly 500 bips a pass, a year and a half or whatever. That means that your cost of capital has gone up quite significantly. Now I've calculated that you break even cash flow wise after about 2 years or so, with assuming the same rate of increase in electricity prices. So cash flow wise you break even roughly after about 2 years. Now that has been stretched about 3 or 4 years now because of the increase in capital. So that of the increase in the cost of capital because of interest rates going up. So the bottom line is it's a good idea to investigate, to invest, at least from my perspective, to invest in solar.
Faure, just coming back to that policy framework and limiting legislation, how do you experience that environment and where do you see it moving in the future?
Great. I just want to emphasize what Dawie said regarding references. There's people that's been in the field and they've done their thing. So, when you buy a car, you can get in the car and drive around and you say, I like this car, let's buy it. And that's what you're paying for a solar system, right? A little bit less, a little bit more. But you can't get in the car and drive around. So get those references, talk to the people, ask how's the after-sale service. I would pay more, a premium, if I know the after-sale service is there. And unfortunately, the guys just disappear once they've got their money. So really, really do that, get those references before you commit to someone. But yes, on the policy side, I would like to give some insights. So part of our work entails not just training installers, that's installing solar PV, but we also educate municipal officials in terms of the latest legislation and regulations to open up this market, because that is one of the barriers that we picked up, is that people install systems, they want to register it with the hope of exporting and getting credits for it, and they can't. We know the city of Cape Town is a few steps ahead of us. They're like, we're going to pay you in cash. You're not going to see that soon from the other Munichs because they don't have the basics in place.
They don't have the cash to pay you back.
Yeah, that's the other issue. They can't even pay Eskom, right? So a few things that I want to say. Yes, I agree from an ideology perspective, and there's a lot of infighting between institutions, for example, Department of Energy and with NERSA. There's infighting because NERSA is putting out certain rules in terms of the game, and then the Department of Energy is like, no, that's not the case. We don't agree with that. We're not taking the same stance. And then it makes it very grey and you can't start applying. But what we did see a few changes, which I think is quite great. The one is the licensing requirement that has been removed, which allows for the private generation to a large extent. I think it was in your slide that you could see the mining industry itself, already with 620 megawatts.
One mining company.
One mining company, and they're going to increase that to, what,
5,000.
3 gigawatts of capacity. That's just the mining industry. We're not talking about the rest because of that licensing cap that's been removed. So I think that's one benefit. The second thing is NERSA issued a consultation paper where they, in effect, forced municipalities to say you have to have an export tariff, you have to update your billing systems, and you have to reimburse people more or less what you would have paid Eskom. And that's sitting in the range of R1.28, which is very great in the context of what we're already paying for electricity. So there's some movement in that regard, and there's a very big push from the Energy Action Plan in terms of, if you look at the activities or the outputs, one of it was rooftop solar. They need to do what they can to open up the industry for rooftop solar. And that includes going to the municipalities to get them up to date with their processes to allow for people to get it connected. Because I think in our context, we think privatization is great and everybody should do their own thing, but in a way that needs to be managed and controlled. Because as long as the penetration is low, we have a few systems connected to the grid, the network can handle that. But in a way, you are now taking over Eskom role because you're generating power. But you still need to adhere to the power qualities. You still need to adhere to the rules of the road because you are now connected to the grid where it was only Eskom driving up and down. Now you also with your system with electrons driving up and down, and you need to adhere to that.
So who do we put in place to manage that if the people who are supposed to be managing it currently have delegated that role to 3 other people who also can't manage it?
Can I answer that?
I can answer.
Let's just see what we have. We've got a Minister of Energy. We've got a Minister of State-owned Enterprises. We've got a Minister of Electricity. We've got a Deputy President responsible for electricity. We've got a committee responsible for electricity. We've got NASA, and we've got this is a mess. Now imagine, as an economist, I know what they do. Eskom, they will go and calculate what the expectations are in terms of what the rand's going to be in a year's time, what interest rate's going to be in a year's time, what energy price is going to be, all these sort of variables. They put it all into a thing and they come with a number and they add some stuff to that. They have a nice big fat margin to that. And they bring this number to NERSA and say, this is what we want. NERSA take this package and they do the whole exercise all over again. Now I'm in this forecasting game. I've been doing it forever. I can't get it right. Okay, but they can. They know exactly where the oil price is going to be, where the rand's going, all that sort of stuff. Then NASA redo the whole thing. They get to an answer and they take some fat away, and then they fight with one another. Eskom will take them to court and get a big. This whole thing is a mess. It's a circus. What we need to do, we have to get rid of all of this. I think Eskom needs to be put under business rescue. We have to liquidate Eskom. We have to sell the private as much as we possibly can. Only keep the distribution, the transmission part. Only keep that. The rest you have to get the private sector and start from scratch, because it's a mess what we have at the moment. It simply doesn't work because everybody's pretending to know what the right price of electricity is. Nobody knows. Not Eskom, not NERSA. Nobody knows. We need to get the market back to determine the right price of electricity.
Hawie, I want to come to you and ask, ideological questions are difficult because they're very broad.
Yeah, so I suppose.
But unfortunately, when it comes to energy, the ideology of the people who make the decisions plays a big role in what we end up with. Being in the news, sometimes I work from the starting point of government has to be wrong, and that's not always necessarily the case. So is some of what the energy ideology is about in South Africa positive? Is any of it positive? What can work? Do we need a mix of nuclear? Do we need a mix of fossil fuel? Can we just from the get-go assume, well, if it's the government and if it's an ANC government, then that has to be bad?
Joe, you shouldn't ask me these questions.
It's because you're sitting next to me.
We just deal with industrial finance and so some engineers and that's it. So pretty factual. We only work with deltas and we try and figure out a solution. But to try and answer your question, look at the current state of what is published. So a good resource for everybody would be Green Cape. Obviously, Western Cape is going green in a big way. Anyway, it's a discussion for another day. But So the recent figures that they published, very clear. And if you look at the planned new capacity, I think there was one slide that actually touched on it, but barring 2023, beyond 2030. So it's a projection up to 2030, where the various renewable resources are supposed to play their part. And so that already is crystal clear for everybody to understand that a mix of technology solutions is on the cards for sure. So back to the previous point, so now it's only a matter of locally, domestically, and or in a particular value chain or industry sector, figuring out what best suits that sector to minimize its cost of electricity across multiple players, and just go for it, and not wait for, so Clem Santa's book, Pretoria to provide or figure it out or whatever. Rather become a bit more innovative and a bit more aggressive in proactively engineering those solutions. That honestly is still where I think all of this is going to go. And that's why I raised the previous point about the ESCOs. So there's allegedly about 50 of them, 50 ESCOs in this country. So these are companies with some project engineering skill, et cetera, able to engineer a particular solution, go raise the capital, and perhaps even sometimes could do it on their own balance sheet. That's possibly the way forward. I'm not trying to speak on behalf of the potato industry. Maybe ultimately potato industry ends up with one ESCO across the entire value chain, maybe. And its task is to lower the average cost of capital across each and every investment wherever the puzzle pieces are being engineered or put in. So I don't know if I digressed a bit from your ideological. But the point
was very eloquently
the
sidestepped.
table. In my view, the table is set to say, you know what, just do whatever it takes. And so, I mean, in a way, that's actually a beautiful landscape. How long it's going to last, different story. And so maybe people like Dawie and so are already thinking in the future. I'm saying this is a very unique opportunity because at some point, maybe 10 years from now, maybe 15 from now, regulation, the dial is going to be shifted back, maybe. So maybe this is the time to engineer whatever suits a value chain, whatever creates employment, whatever attracts new investment into the value chain, makes it attractive. Now is the time to engineer all of those. There's a lot of effort required because we don't have all the ready-made answers in terms of your technology mixes. But clearly there's that thinking to say wherever it comes from. Oh, don't forget, even SMRs. So small modular reactors, that's my prediction. Within the next 5, 6, 10 years, you'll see a few in this country, whether you're part of it or not, there's your choice. I'm just saying, even in those estimates, you'll see there's a column that says nuclear. Yes, Kuberg update, but SMRs coming. And you can, if you wish. Because so these regulatory ceilings have been raised or removed, so it provides a beautiful opportunity to actually play into it now.
Faure, you wanted to add?
No, I just wanted to add, I foresee that on paper there's a few good things. If you look, for example, at the Integrated Resource Plan or the IRP, and that's where the table is coming from, it's saying that we need to diversify our energy supply, that's a good business principle to do anyway, and reduce our fossil fuel dependency. So that's clear. And with that, for example, the Energy Action Plan. Our issue is not the plans and what should be done, it's the implementation. And I think that's what I wanted to highlight is that we've got everything on paper, but in terms of results, we don't see. And I'm of the view, let's not wait because they can't implement. We've seen it time and time and again. As soon as it's in the wrong hands, the opposite happens. We don't see what we should do. So unfortunately, that's the limitation.
Talk to us about smart grids, just while you're...
Okay, so in terms of smart grids or microgrids or nanogrids, depends on how you're looking at. It is I want to say, established and mature technology that's happening worldwide. It's happening in South Africa as we speak. So we're talking about estates and complexes or mini municipalities that's going into that phase to say, okay, you know what, let's create this node of power supply and storage where we can operate connected to the utility. But if we have to, we can isolate and we can operate independently. So, and for that, obviously, you need much more better collaboration within the different stakeholders there. But I think we limit it within the current legislation to roll that out on a larger scale. We saw that with that Frankfurt municipality, that there's this independent municipality or
Rural maintenance.
yes, that wanted to operate their own municipality, and they said, we've got generation, we can actually, based on our generation, reduce the impact of load shedding, and that's what the City of Cape Town is doing. And the reason why it's thrown out was actually because of, in my opinion, just the municipality was not on board. That was the key reason. It wasn't what they wanted to achieve. But Eskom did argue to say, but we're creating a scenario where people can do what they want, and then we can't control the network and manage the network. And obviously, there's risk involved. I'm not denying that. But the point is, I think that's a space where now the regulation has been updated to allow individuals to generate power to do their own thing, but not really across the network, because it's the municipality or the Eskom's network. And that is where we now need to tread the water to gain more, because in principle, just to talk about microgrids, the utilization of storage increases with up to 40% as soon as you start sharing it between consumers. Because when you consume more, I consume less. So there's this diversification of utilization. And I think that's where the limitation lies. The technology is there. We've got people in our own country at Northwest University, Potchefstroom, people doing research and implementing that as we speak. But again, the limitation would be at certain applications, but it can be much broader than that.
It's great to see people get excited and the passion is there.
Can I just add two things to that? There are 40,000 people working in Eskom. They're gonna fight like mad to prevent any competition. And the second one, the local authorities are very dependent on selling electricity as a source of revenue. The local authorities are not going to allow. They don't want the generation of private electricity. They don't want that.
That is true.
They're going to lose a source of revenue. And remember, I can give you all the numbers. So what's going to happen about all this debt now? What's going to happen to that? It's not only Eskom's debt, it's also the local authorities. They owe 60 billion rand to Eskom.
And if I could compound that, municipalities in Eskom, you can tell me if my numbers are incorrect, but I think because they're so dependent on selling revenue in terms of electricity, they're losing more due to load shedding than they're losing due to alternative supply. People
I have a number, that's a valid point.
Yeah, so they're losing more due to load shedding because they can't sell electricity, because then all your clients are off. But when Eskom is there, then a few clients has a backup system. So you can't, it's not there. So they're losing because of their own fault. Yeah. Eskom indicated, when Mr. Underdirector was there, 1 year there was a financial year, he had a profit. I remember they said they were actually showing a profit, if I remember correctly. I don't know if I've got it wrong. But this year they said there was a loss. And I immediately realized they've got a loss because they're selling less. The system is not there to sell electricity. So they're their own detriment, not the people putting up their own solar.
So they're vested interest that you're not going to change.
Media houses have started referring to them as the only company in South Africa that cannot sell their only product. They're just incapable of producing and selling their own.
Or encourage you not to use their product.
Or not to use it.
Yes.
I want to give an opportunity for you, Johan and Sarel, to maybe... I'll open the floor a little bit later so you can also ask questions, but what do you want to hear from any of our experts except me? I don't answer questions, I only ask them.
Well, from my side, I think me and Faure had a discussion about the biomass and how has it been tested and what is the opportunities going forward and how many must still go into it that it can be viable. And is it something, or is it just just a pie in the sky? And except from that, it's quite depressing because everything seems like it's a mess.
Was that a question?
Yeah, well.
Maybe can I
There's
shoot
more
my
comment.
Can I shoot my question? Maybe
Okay,
we'll
go
cover
for it.
the same area. Yeah, well, to get a real alternative that would be able to be that you can move around in different locations, so that can be used as an alternative in your different production areas.
So mobile alternative that can be used even on rented land.
That's great.
Yeah. To my knowledge, I always have a saying, technically anything is possible.
Yeah.
So it's just a question of how deep is your pockets, or are your pockets. So just the fact that you've got this very unique need, and I foresee you won't be the only people with this unique need of having energy needs at certain areas, makes sense for moving this energy source around. I would even think this nuclear application, maybe that could also be on, they're putting it on ships. They're putting it on other forms of mobile applications. So I must be honest, can recall or point out something specifically now, except for example with the diesel generation would be one. But maybe just to come back to the biogas point, one of the reasons why biogas couldn't really pick up traction in our country, even though the RRP makes provision for that, even though we do have biogas and mass projects going on, is that the stock, the one is it competes with food security, because now you need the produce that you need to generate electricity is competing with the food market. So that's a little bit of a challenge there. But let's say that's not the problem. You've got a lot of wastage that's anyway not going to go to the food market. Biomass needs quite a constant supply in terms of stock to produce electricity. And again, you're working with something that's volatile in the sense that the weather changes, so you've got a different crop production. Or the market just changes and you say, sorry, we're not going to sell it, we're not going to waste it, we need to sell the produce. And that then kills the business case or make it a high-risk application. So I think, I explained that in biomass you need this much amount of stock or supply so that you can generate power from this portion, so that you have some flexibility in terms of that regard. So is it possible? I think technically yes. It's just a case of looking at all the variables, like Hawie pointed out, and saying, okay, can we do it and can we fund it with one or another funding mechanism?
Will that need to be on a big scale, or can you start it on a small scale?
Well, there's people doing it on residential level.
Oh, really?
There's people generating, they typically generate methane gas, and with that they operate their gas geysers or their gas stove. So the technology is there, it exists, it can be incorporated. It's just a case of getting the information, because even when I did research with my colleagues in Germany, they asked me for numbers. They said, let's look at the numbers so that it's not a quick, okay, you can do it, go for it. And that's what we don't have. And that's the stuff that I would propose we really need to investigate.
Hawie, in amongst all of these variables is climate change. And that changes how we utilize energy. Obviously, that's one of the purposes is to use cleaner energy, but also, we just, as a basic starting point, want some energy. Looking at how climate change is impacting not just agriculture, but every sector, and some of the unknowns. You showed a slide in your presentation, I think, if I'm not actually remembering one of Faure's again, that said that the carbon footprint and the end-of-life reclamation of solar and wind, as they are as yet unknown.
Yep.
So how do we empower farmers, once again, producers, everyone in the value chain, to make responsible decisions now that aren't going to bite them later?
I don't know, it sounds like we're punting the role of project engineers here, but you do need to get very factual about this. So to do the figures and the sums of existing technology platforms, for lack of a better word, and then projecting little into the future, because this data is being published. And by the way, those technology readiness levels that I had up there, 7 and 8 and so forth, I suspect many of them are actually a bit higher. International Energy Agency may be a bit conservative. So factoring all of that in to then rely on the advice, the engineering advice of whoever that third party is to provide that input, but on a factual basis, so that one can then crunch the numbers, build the discounted cash flow models, see what potentially could be feasible or not. And in most cases, you'll find that it'll require significant a piece of equity to go into that transaction, otherwise it won't fly. And therein lies our challenge. So I'm still of the opinion, back to the last slide, it's actually a financial engineering problem. It sounds like we're shifting it, but it's about the current appetite for seeing a minimum threshold of an IRR at some level and then deciding whether a transaction is doable or not. And I think that's where our next challenge lies. I partially answered your question.
Picking up on your point about the financial models, Dawie, you talked a bit about the need for financing to change, how it is already changing, not only with the introduction of AI, access to finance models, but how we view, I don't want to get into economics because that's entirely different, but making things more accessible. Do you see an appetite from financiers to really buy into making these new technologies accessible? And just to, I mean, I remember coming across information about a fund where you can actually invest into new technologies where banks don't have the appetite, but private individuals can. But when do the banks develop an appetite?
I think this is not only a question about energy, it's also about agriculture as well. Because what farmers typically do, like I've said, you will go to the bank and you borrow money and you go and plant your stuff and you go and take off your harvest and you go and repay the bank. That's a basic business model. That is pretty much, I think, very much outdated because you're making use of very expensive credit. There are many other sources of credit. You can go for certain funds, for example. There are various funds available, like private equity funds available that actually specialize in this kind of stuff. But a market that I think is very, very much underutilized. The only problem here is the critical mass. You can't borrow R1 million. You probably need to go and borrow $1 billion or $2 billion or whatever. But it can be put together because it's possible to do that, and that's the capital market. I think there's huge opportunity, especially in the capital market. Basically, what the capital market is, you go and you borrow a lot of money, and you place this paper in the market, and the paper will start trading in the market, and it will eventually end up with a pension fund or with an insurer or whatever the case may be. So I think that is the place where you need to be. But the issue here is critical mass. You need to be able to be in a position to borrow a lot of money. And that goes for agriculture as well. I think farmers need to get together, and they actually need to go and use the capital market. That's much cheaper. You can borrow so much cheaper there in the capital market.
Yes, but potentially a question I shouldn't be asking, but I'm going to ask it because that's what I do. In terms of farmers getting together, there's so many different organizations that represent different commodities, farmers from different regions, farmers with different loyalties. When do we get...
Not in finance.
Not in finance.
Not as far as I know.
But in terms of, you said farmers need to get together.
For finance, yes.
For finance.
Yeah.
So separate to all the currently existing organizations.
Correct. And they need to get bigger. And that's happening. Farmers are getting bigger.
Absolutely.
I think it's an opportune moment to open the floor to questions from the floor. And I see a hand here already. Can we have the handheld mic ready, please? I think we've got about 15 minutes, so that's quite solid time. Please feel free to bombard us. We've already touched on some of the questions on the WhatsApp forum, but you're more than welcome to raise your hands.
Yes, my question, it's more a comment than a question. It's on the farmers getting together, and one of the main issues, and the Frankfurt story is only half of it. There is currently a High Court case against a group of farmers who own their own distribution network.
Hello? So we almost done. If you can allow us...
Sorry, can we just switch off Faure's mic for a moment? Sorry, Harvey.
Yes.
Okay.
Just to go back.
Sorry. I don't want to speak in between the other people, but the problem is...
Sorry, I've opened a can of worms.
The problem is that the case the municipal agencies is making is based on the constitution that says they the sole providers of the distribution rights in local government, including farms. So that is going to be one very, very important case that should be taken care of before farmers can get together and produce their own energy, because it's always more efficient when you do it in big numbers. But the problem is currently government or local municipalities, like Dawie said, is doing their utmost best to keep the goose that lays the golden eggs.
Yeah,
so that is going to be a very, very important piece of legislation that we need to address. Because if farmers can distribute their own power and use their own grid like is currently done in Peterstein, it can be done to generate power. But if you lose that right, you're in real deep trouble. And I think that's going to be a very important case.
Can I answer that question? And that is, you talk about the Constitution, talk about the law, it's a piece of paper. That's not really what the Constitution is. A Constitution is guided by a piece of paper, but the Constitution is what actually happens. That is actually the Constitution, what it really happens. And we've got a fluid Constitution in South Africa that keeps on changing depending on your interpretation thereof. That is the reality. So the reality is eventually that you probably wouldn't need to change legislation. It is just going to happen, and the interpretation will be softened in such a manner that it becomes kind of legal. Because there are many examples where it is the Constitution is changing. They fucked up. Perhaps not the piece of paper, but it is changing because that is the way that it's happening at the moment. And that's not bad necessarily.
No.
Yeah.
So perhaps the answer is there to push ahead
Just go ahead. So,
and make things happen and see what happens. I think Faure is. Well, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say, with us engaging the municipalities, I totally agree with you. There's a big political resistance against alternative energy, and they want to protect, in a way they've become dependent on the sale of electricity, which is not supposed to be the case. Electricity sales in terms of revenue is only supposed to be there to pay the people that's working there and to supply the power. But now obviously it's being used for all other services. So they're going to protect that. I think that's a reality that's there. But they also know, not all, but some of them realize that they can't stop it. There's no way to prevent them from happening. So they're a little bit more open to say, okay, let's allow you guys, but it needs to be managed. And I think, if I think about the Frankfurt case, if they really took the municipality on board, because remember, they're also unknown to this technology like you are. They're unfamiliar and they don't know the risk and the implications. So my approach would have been to pull them on board, explain them the reality, and it might be that they want to fall back to default to say, no, it's our network, go away. Or they can say, they have an opportunity to be part of that and benefit from that. And I would say, like Dawie said, one option is you do it and see what's the implication. The other is to say, how can we incorporate these people? Because in a way they have a say, and I know they're messing up a lot of things, but the bottom line is we need them as part of the mix to make it work and to make it sustainably work. And that would be my approach and suggestion, to say, okay, if we're going to do this, and I can tell you now, from a Western Cape perspective, there's Cape Town. Their intention is to say goodbye for Eskom as far as possible. So anyone else coming to them and say, I'll help you, they'll say, let's do this. So there's already that motion, and my uptake is to try that at least.
Can I just mention that 70% of municipalities are financially under the water? 70.
So in this instance, where sometimes it's easier to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission, in this instance, we should ask for partnership rather than either of those options.
That's what I would propose, yeah.
Questions? Yes.
Thank you, Anlie. Thank you to the panel. I think it's a very interesting discussion. Maybe a different angle. When we talk about alternative energy supplies and the exploitation of energy, we, as an economist, we often think of a worst case scenario. And maybe a question, for not to put you on the spot, but do you have any technical background or context, for instance, in the event of a total blackout or a total grid collapse? Should we be more prepared for that? And maybe just your opinion on the likelihood. I think we can just think of the impact on value chains, the supply of waterworks. We've talked about the cold chain. So maybe just a bit of a different angle, and should we be more prepared for an event like that? Thank you.
Okay, great. The term blackout is being used loosely because some people talk about blackout as load shedding, which is not the same thing. But just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about, a total grid collapse or blackout is you sit with a situation where your supply of generation of power and your demand is not in balance. Your frequency, which is actually the heartbeat of the system, goes below a certain frequency because it's typically the consumption is more than the generation. And your network will just start to switch off. So you'll have a situation where a lot of your generation units desynchronize and stops to generate power, and then that stops. So that's reality. Is it a possibility? If I read what the experts saying and the people that's in the network, they said that Eskom is under a lot of trouble. There's been instances where They planned for a certain load shedding situation. That was not the case. They had to load shed more to balance it out again. So for me, and the fact that I want to say the emergency reserve, which is your diesel generators, are now running constantly in the load shedding periods, is already telling me that we're very close to a point where we don't have reserve left. So we're in a very dark territory in that regard. The implications thereof, because that's the question. Some people say in the best case scenario, it's going to take a few weeks to get the power on. And I don't think we understand the impact of not having electricity for 2 weeks, as an example, as a country. Because we are so dependent on electricity for other activities around electricity. Internet access, making payments, being able to fill up fuel to drive somewhere. The list just goes on. So to be honest, I don't even want to think about it because it's very demoralizing to think about it. Your question about should we be concerned about it or should we prepare? I think we should do what we can in the context of what our needs are now, and indirectly it will address that possibility of if something goes south, then at least we've got something we can fall back onto. That's the first point. And the second point is, yes, Eskom is messing up a lot of things, but I think one area, and Dawie indirectly alluded to that, one area Eskom is doing very well, they job quite well, is on transmission level, and to keep the grid up and running. And it's because they still have very good people there. And I'm actually concerned about that because, I don't know, do you know Eskom people that's like, I'm working for Eskom? You know, they're very demoralized and the good people are getting frustrated because of a lot of political interference. And I'm concerned about that because the people that are sitting behind the driving wheel, they're just like, okay, well, come, take over. I'm fed up with this. And they're staying there because they know the impact that they have and the contribution they're making. And that's why I'm of the view we really need, I don't know how, but we need to look after these people that's looking after the country in a way, because they're looking after the network. So, and I want to say that they've put in a lot of checks and balances in place to prevent the chances of a total grid collapse as far as possible. And keep in mind, Eskom is not just South Africa, it's the SADC region. It forms part of the SAP pool. So we've got other countries that's part of that, and they're also supplying power. And all of these bits and pieces are working together to make sure that if in extreme conditions happen, that some way or somehow they will still keep the grid going, even if it's a portion of the network, and then bringing the rest back. So my perception is that, and my hope actually as well, is that it's still, it's not going to happen as such, but it's obviously not an impossibility. I don't know if someone wants to add on that point.
God, we are running slightly short on time. We've got 5 minutes left, and I still would like to give each of our panel members the opportunity, if you'd like to utilize it, to make a last closing statement. So one last question from here.
Just a quick one, Dawie. You mentioned the political risk. So in the fresh produce industry, we also have fresh produce markets that belong to the local government, which is also in the same state as Eskom. And we are looking at privatization on that. But obviously, that's also a source of income to that local municipality or the local government, which is also in the same situation as Eskom, where it's going to be saying, no, you're not going to take that golden goose away. So in terms of that, and in terms of the political risk with Eskom, where government or parastatals need that income, at what point are we going to reach that tipping point where the politicians can't dictate anymore and say, we have to now let the markets go, or we have to now let Eskom go so that the country can survive? Yeah. When are we going to get to that?
Yeah, that's actually an excellent question, and unfortunately, it takes too long for politicians to realize that. And I think this example with Montage is a good one, of how we increased this how much we're allowed to generate. It makes me think a little bit of Winston Churchill, what he said about the Americans once. And he said that you can always expect the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the alternatives. And that is pretty much what is happening. So because of ideological reasons, they are simply just do not want to let go, and they only let go once it's too late. And the price that we are paying, we know Eskom is going to come to an end. We know that. So accept that reality and manage that process. Unfortunately, they don't want to accept that. And the same goes for the other state-owned enterprises. So we're paying a price because of the politieke verstoktheid, the ideological verstoktheid what we have currently. And that is the main issue that we have in the country. Yeah.
Right. I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to give some closing thoughts shortly, if we can keep it to about a minute or 2 minutes each. Sorry to limit you. I think we've had a very nice, robust conversation so far. Hawie, if I can start with you.
Well, I have to think to try and compress it in 1 minute. I'm back to my previous point that I think we at the point where, I mean, it so happens, and it was a beautiful opportunity to be here today. So, potato value chain, many others, but yours particular. My sense of the future is you aggressively, Braveheart type. So you really got to step out there, create something that previously did not exist. In the midst of everything that was said here, most importantly, trying to put together some sort of entity, if you like, maybe it's a third-party player that engineers solutions across the entire value chain. They would take the risk on their balance sheet and take that part out of the lives of individual producers, packagers, transporters, etc., etc. I think that's the future. Specifically, trying to figure out a different financial model, because a stack of equity is going to be required, particularly if you're forward-thinking and you want to plug a position now, say, for over 5 or 10 years. It's going to be vanadium flow batteries, a few others have been mentioned here. And knowing full well at the moment, when you go to Standard Bank and even Nedbank, very green, they possibly won't fund it, or possibly a portion of the debt. So you're going to need that third party. So it's time for some serious financial engineering through perhaps a body that makes it its core business across your entire value chain. That's what I think.
Faure, over to you.
Great. I think the first thing I want to highlight is what I've seen with my own postgraduate studies is that when we start looking at our energy apply, the one part that's always left behind is the environmental part. So in the context of sustainability, yes, we want to have a solution as quick as possible from a financial and from a technical perspective. But let us not forget about the sustainability part. I mean, as we're looking backwards now and we say, coal-fired power station, what have we done, in terms of the environment? That we don't do this when we look back and say there was alternatives that has a lower impact on the environment. So that's one point. And the last one is, I think we really need to think about acting now. And that's to link to you on the bank side. Personally, I think the losses of not taking action is much more than taking action and thinking backwards. It could have been differently. So that's my point of view, is to do that, and the banks need to, in a way, quantify that so that they can easily finance, not necessarily because the project itself makes financial sense, but to prevent the losses of the operation.
Dawie?
Yeah, what I think is important is for all of us to realize that we are in for some dramatic changes at various levels.
Correct.
There's some dramatic technological changes happening. We've heard about the clever people talking about technological changes. There are some changes, and as far as finances are concerned in South Africa, it is going to happen. The local authorities are bankrupt, the state-owned enterprises are bankrupt, the state is pretty much bankrupt, so something will give there. It means that you have to restructure stuff there. And there are some major political changes happening in South Africa as well. So be prepared, this is going to be a bit of a rough ride, but during change, there's always opportunity. So stick it out, remember we're still a democracy, and in the end, the responsibility is with you. So you walk into that voting booth, make the right decision.
And if I can add my own philosophical musings to that, growth only happens outside of our comfort zone. And if we look at South Africans, some of us may feel like a frog in water that's boiling ever so slowly, and we feel we're reaching that tipping point. But at each degree that the water gets hotter, we find ourselves adapting already. So we might not be frogs when we end, when we exit the pot. We might be dinner, but we'll still get there. Within the context that there are players from various elements of the role of the value chain here, input suppliers, representational bodies. Johan, are there any thoughts you would like to leave us with, questions that you feel are still unanswered, or points that you think the industry as a whole needs to address?
Yeah, I don't think at this moment any questions. I think we just realizing now also that that's really contentious, the energy crisis, and that there is a lot of alternatives. I mean, we get so mixed up in our own small world, and that there is a lot of solutions out there. I think I know now where to alternatively go and look for money or grants. alternative objects, and projects like biogas or biomass. And well, what I've learned is that it might be that I won't be able to buy brandy in the future. And Emil, I'm glad you're here because I know now I mustn't pay too much tax. And yeah, no, I think it was very interesting, and yeah, I think going forward, obviously there's a lot of obstacles that we must tackle, and yeah, I think this has been very interesting.
What did you hear at the Potatoes SA event today? Don't pay tax and you won't be able to buy brand. I'm sorry, Bernie.
No.
Sarel, over to you.
Yes, thank you. No, thank you for Potato Site hosting this. You know, the whole agricultural and added value industry is struggling with the same problems, and we've come to see a lot of new resources that might be available in the future. Always difficult to make a decision, and you might end up 2 years, 3 years later with the wrong decision.
Yeah.
That's always the risk.
Yep.
But yeah, sometimes challenges like this that we now forces you to become fit again, and you make the right choices. Yeah, thanks a lot for that.
Thank you so much to both of you for your inputs and for sharing your experiences. I think it brings a valuable component to any discussion like this. It can all be very academic, but as soon as we have some practical examples and questions from the ground, that really does make the conversation a lot more practical and applicable. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you for your time and for listening to us. And on that note, I'm going to hand back over to our chairman.